I'm Andrew Hall, and this is Dead Hand Radio. My guest for this episode is UFO researcher Graeme Rendall. Graeme is a photographer, author, and has a fascination with the Cold War era technology, and more precisely, Cold War aircraft. In fact, he's written a 428-page book with over 200 photographs called To the Ends of the Earth, a snapshot of aviation in North Eastern Siberia, which we're going to talk about tonight in depth. During the summer of 1992, Graeme traveled to the former Soviet territory after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I'm really interested to hear all about that excursion. Graeme has also written for Shadows of Your Mind magazine, The Debrief, and UAP Media UK. All of these outlets are high quality, well researched organizations that maintain the highest standard of reporting for any articles they accept for publication. And we're going to talk about all of that and UFOs on this episode, starting right now. Welcome to Dead Hand Radio, Graeme.
Andrew, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Well, I know it is late in your part of the world, being
It
in
is.
the UK, and so we're going to make this quick, efficient, and get as much quality information out to the people that are interested in hearing about it. But I have some questions I'd really like to find out about you growing up as a child of the Cold War. Is that okay if we begin there?
That's perfect, yes.
Great. So, as I mentioned, you grew up in England, right?
Yep.
During the Cold War era from the late 60s. And then did you graduate high school from the same town that you grew up in?
Yes, so I live in the north of England. I've lived in the north of England all my life. And I didn't actually graduate because I got into high school and then I should have done the good thing and gone to university, but I sort of dropped out of life at that time. I got bored with school. There were other things I wanted to do, and that wasn't my focus anymore. So I went and got a job instead of going to university. So that's pretty much what I did. But my interests sort of in terms of academic qualifications, at one time I was interested and then I got bored. And so I went and did something else instead.
I get that. There's really two choices. When you're getting out of high school, you can either go to school, continue your education, or you could go into the workforce, whether
That's right.
that's whether that's in the military or directly into a job of some kind. Um, but so rewinding back to the, probably the early 70s. Uh, Full disclosure, I podcast from my home, and Mondays are garbage day. The garbage truck is right outside picking up, and my neighbor's dogs are going crazy. So there's probably going to be some background noise. Many apologies for that to those listening. But so, yeah, rewinding back to the early 70s when
Mm.
you were a young lad in England, northern England, growing up. Do you remember what your first experience was when you became aware that there was a threat of possible nuclear war?
So if you read the magazines and the newspapers and watched the television at the time, and you were curious, even as maybe a 6 or 7 year old, you had an idea that there was some kind of threat. It wasn't very specific because you didn't understand the geopolitical realities in the world, but you knew there was something there because you'd either hear your parents talking about it, or there would be some item on the news which would show a lot of tanks and missile launches and all the rest of it. But it was only when I read a book that mentioned the Hiroshima bomb and about the effects of it, and I think I read it when I was about 7 year old. I might have read it out from the school library, and it sort of rammed home just how destructive and how chaotic the after effects of such a weapon would be. And I think I talked to my parents at the time about it. Just one of these kind of conversations that somebody of that age would have. Of really questioning and just trying to find out the reality of the situation. and my parents probably filled in some of the blanks as well as to how horrible it would have been, even though they probably weren't privy to the proper facts in terms of what it would be like after such a detonation for the local populace. But I took that on board, and then I couldn't sleep. I had nightmares for several nights afterwards. And so I would be what 7 or 8 year old maybe. And I remember my mother coming into the bedroom one night and saying to me that don't be afraid. We have a bomber that flies around the UK, and if there was a strike, or a bomb dropped here, they would go up and drop a bomb on them. But I think back now, and I mean, obviously that satisfied me at the time and made me sleep. But I think back now, and it's a case of they were living in the Second World War still. It was that kind of mentality. They didn't have the concept of knowing minute warning. They were still thinking in terms of bombers coming across from the Soviet Union and dropping freefall bombs, if you like, on British targets and then flying back home. Much like our Lancasters did, that we went and bombed Germany and then came back. They were still living in the past. They weren't living in the future. I don't know if that makes sense, but if you know what I mean there.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, so your parents were probably young children, if they were even born at that time, right? During the 40s, during the
So
end of World War
my
II.
father was my father was 14 when the war started. My mother was 9. So they lived through the war as either teenagers or or young children. So yes,
Got it.
they were quite aware of it.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Now, I was, um, I don't want to go that far back, but yeah, I get the reason why. I mean, that was to have your entire country bombed, for days on end like that, and then have the fear of that bombing. I don't know how far north the Germans bombed in England, but
Oh,
they were
they
bombing.
bombed Newcastle. Yeah,
They were bombing the heck out of
yeah.
that country for months, and to live through that, and then see what happened in Hiroshima at the end of World War II and Nagasaki, and then knowing that technology now exists that could wipe out entire cities. Um,
Yes.
yeah, I could see where people would have to tell themselves some kind of a story to make themselves feel okay and be able to go through their daily lives, right?
Well, I think in some ways, I just don't think they understood the gravity of the situation. They didn't understand, the actual power of a bomb like that. I mean, saying that it can level a city is one thing, but actually understanding it and seeing it is a different thing entirely. And then all the after effects that come with that kind of detonation is just something else as well. And people even back then didn't understand the term nuclear winter. That came along later.
That's right. True.
Yeah.
So some of the other memories that you had as a child growing up during the Cold War, um, there were, like you said, you're not aware of the geopolitical um, events going on around the world, but you do hear things from your parents. I know that I did hear things, and as I got a little bit older, I started to become a little bit more aware of some of that. The potential threats and the things that people were afraid of. And one of those things,
Hmm.
a lot of people thought that when Ronald Reagan was elected into office, that it was going to result in a World War III with the Soviet Union. Did you have anything like that when you were growing up?
I knew people who were sort of that impression, but they were kind of on the political left here. Maybe a bit of a hawk, if you like, and either start a conflict or be responsible for one. I was a bit more pragmatic. I just felt that you've got to give people a chance to prove themselves before you start sort of labeling people. So I thought I would just wait and see. That was my look at it. But things can spiral out of control from the least small scenario. So anything was possible. I just felt that there was enough going on in the world that things could spark from anything. It didn't matter whether he was in charge or anybody else was in charge. If it was going to start, it was going to start. And it could have started anywhere, because there were points all over the globe where the Americans and the Russians were not actually fighting each other, but they were fighting each other by proxy with other countries. So there were conflicts in Africa that were being supported by the factions fighting each other that were probably supported by other sides. You had Afghanistan, where the Russians had walked in at one stage to prop up the Afghan government, but then of course the Americans were supplying the rebels. So that there was another kind of potential flashpoint there, and of course there were others as well. So yeah, there was a whole lot of things that could have gone south really quickly. I think the thing about Reagan, when he came into power, was that was the time when the CND issue, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament issue, was quite big in the UK. So you have the peace camps around the American Air Force bases, especially the ones that had nuclear aircraft that were could launch nuclear weapons. So you had the peace women, the people who used to live in these kind of caravans and tents around the bases, and they had placards and banners, and they used to go on marches around the base. And that was a thing I saw a lot on the news. And there would be marches in town and city centres every so often, especially on a Saturday when a lot of people were out shopping. So they would try and get maximum attention. So you would go somewhere in Newcastle, my local city, go shopping, and then there'll be a march with banners for CND. Sometimes it wouldn't be every week, and it probably wouldn't be every month, but you'd see it maybe once or twice a year. And then of course you get leaflets through the door, especially at election time, with quite sort of apocalyptic messages. So saying what the effects of a nuclear strike on Newcastle would be to the population, and that was quite frightening to get those just directly through your front door, just as a mail shot. So that's the other side of the globe, there was somebody else in charge that may or may not have been more likely to spark a nuclear war.
Yeah, there were a lot of flashpoints, like you suggested, and I mean we could talk about that endlessly because there was so much going on, but there was also some. It was also a period of great advancement, technological advancement, medical advancement, artistic. I always like to draw that contrast during the Cold War era, that it was one of the most frightening periods in history because of the tensions between Soviets and the Western allies. But it was also a period of growth that had never been equaled up until that point. If you think about the Apollo space program, sending astronauts to the moon, and the space race itself, I mean, what the Soviets did by putting satellites and rockets into space before the Americans. It was a huge blow to the American ego, but it was still pushing forward the technological advancements of humanity, which in my mind was a good thing.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the whole space race issue was a race between the Americans and Russians, effectively to see who could get the man on the moon first. And as you say, the Russians had the head start, but they did things on a shoestring, and they did things, by the seat of their pants, in terms of, kind of putting people in danger. I mean, it was a danger anyway, sending people into orbit. But the Russians were quite cavalier about what they could get away with. But then again, you could do that in a totalitarian state. You could send people into danger without all the checks and balances that you would have, from the American space program. So, but when you look back at it and you look at the history there, the Americans obviously won the race, but the the Russians did try, but then they found that they got to a point where they couldn't build it was just beyond them.
Yeah.
But I remember being a child. One of my first TV memories was watching one of the Apollo landings. Now, bear in mind, I was born in 1966. It wasn't one of the first ones. It wasn't Apollo 11. It wasn't Apollo 12. Apollo 17. So, I think 17 was in December 1972. And I remember being allowed to sit up and watch one live on TV one night, and just being totally transfixed by the images that were coming across on the TV of people walking on the moon. It was, as you say, as a kind of technological leap. It was just absolutely fantastic, and that fires the imagination as well. Yeah, and I was really interested in space travel then, and not just putting men on the moon, but also sending probes out to other planets. So, NASA embarked on not just sending satellites to Mars, but they sent the pioneers out to Jupiter and Saturn out. So that was a huge leap in terms of what knowledge we had about the solar system. Never mind planet Earth and the moon. It was totally amazing.
Definitely. Yeah, it was it was an exciting time to be alive and to be growing up during that period. Now, toward the end of the Cold War, we're going to talk about that, wind down the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, because that leads into the next part of our conversation. But before we get to that part, we'll talk about the Berlin Wall coming down. You were probably in your teens or late teens at that time.
Well, the wall came down in '89, so I would have been 23.
Oh, good call. I forgot. I was 23 as well. For some reason, I thought I was younger, but yeah, okay. I was in my 20s. But yeah, I remember how I felt. Do you remember where you were at and how you felt when you heard about that?
Yeah, I remember bits of it because the writing had been on the wall for the Eastern Bloc for a little while. They were running out of money for one thing, and there was dissension in most of the countries that made up the former Warsaw Pact, not just Russia. You could possibly go back as far as Chernobyl in '86 to find that there was kind of cracks in the system. That they handled that really badly. But I think if you fast forward to about 1989, there were riots in East Germany just before the final kind of sort of the end to the regime, as it were. And they were reported that they were suppressed in the Eastern Bloc, but news got out to the West, so you could tell that things were going slightly wrong, and you couldn't work out where it was going, but you thought it's going to end badly, and that's what I felt. A lot of people I knew back then felt the same, that it was going to end in kind of brutality. They would crack down on these things, and I think maybe they did it in some level, but it took on a kind of momentum of its own. So you had riots in East Germany and big protests. I mean, sometimes 100,000 people in some of the cities. I think Dresden, maybe in Dresden, I can't remember exactly which one it was, but there was a big demonstration. And then other countries as well sort of followed suit in smaller ways. And then of course Romania, and that might have been the least likely of places for something to actually kick off. But that's obviously where it all started in terms of dismantling of the Eastern Bloc with Ceausescu and his downfall. And I just remember seeing the news and thinking, wow, this kind of thing doesn't happen, Or if you do, it's something you read about in a book, you don't see it on the TV, And then it was just like a kind of line of dominoes just falling one by one, and then the next thing you knew, the wall's coming down, and the wall had been a symbol of them versus us for my entire life, and yet now somebody was knocking a hole in it, and people were putting their hands through and shaking hands with each other from one side of the wall to the other. It was enough to make you cry. It was just overpowering. It was a sensation of what next. It was. I don't even have words for it. Even now, it was just something. It was short of amazing, and the people there. To be there and to be somewhere on the east side, and just to have that kind of barrier lifted and be able to walk and meet people, I can't even imagine what it must be like for them.
Yeah, well, yeah, for them. I mean, for us as spectators, seeing it happen, and you know the the idea of that wall coming down because it had been such a fixture for decades and such a symbol of the division between the
Mm,
West and the East, and that wall being taken down, dismantled by human hands. It's like I remember seeing, I guess, videos of it on the news where people were smashing it with sledgehammers, right?
yeah.
And that wall was, I don't know, 3 or 4 feet thick, and they're hitting it with sledgehammers. And then there was people standing up on top dancing. When prior to that, if you tried to cross that barrier, you would have been shot. It was just a
Oh, of course,
really,
that's right. And
it marked a huge change in uh, in the entire consciousness of the world throughout the world. I think, and then
yeah,
like you said, after that, it was a domino effect, and the Soviet Union being such a monumentous uh, um, institution, having
yeah,
being such a powerhouse, well, a superpower, and collapsing, losing its grip on all these satellite states and being, completely dismantled. Uh, it was an amazing time, and looking back on it, I can appreciate it a lot more than I was able to appreciate it during the time that it was happening. But during the time that it was happening, it was still pretty significant because in my lifetime growing up, as well as you experienced, the Soviet Union stood for all that was bad in the world, at least in my mind. I know, that's a stereotypical viewpoint, but you know, the Soviet Union stood for oppression and threat to freedom, threat to our safety, and that being taken away, that being gone, was like, wow, what, like you said, what's going to happen next? And then
yeah.
what did
Well, we'd
happen
live
next?
with it for all. We'd live with it for all of our life, hadn't we? So,
Yes,
as you say, there'd been this barrier across Europe, and there'd been a barrier around the world in one way or another. So it was us versus them, and the way it was into every part of life. So it was into the military part of life. It was in the civilian part of life. It was in social, artistic, sporting. Everything had an east-west kind of slant to it. You couldn't go on a news bulletin without hearing some kind of story about whether it was the Russians or the Americans and some kind of friction somewhere. But I think at some stage during my teens, so this is obviously going back a lot earlier than the breakup of the Soviet Union, that I realised that, well, the Russians are people as well. It might have been that Sting song called Russians, where there's a line where it says that the Russians love their children too.
yeah.
And I must have just realised at some stage that you know there's ordinary people live there, and I wanted to find out a bit more about what life was really like just for ordinary people, not for the people who were in the pulling the levers of power, but the people who just had to get on with everyday lives. So, and I had a radio that had a shortwave on it, and you could pick up Radio Moscow. So I can remember going through a phase where at night times I would be sitting listening to these English language broadcasts, and of course, I mean, I knew it was propaganda, but you got a little bit of an idea about what life was like for just ordinary people, and some of the stories were quite interesting. And it was life about, it was like kind of farming and some space travel stuff, and then they had occasionally about ferry boats going like sinking on the Volga with lots of people dying and all the rest of the you'd get to hear about it a bit afterwards. But it was just like a kind of slice of life, and you got the feeling that they're not different from from us. They're no different from we have different the same kind of lives. Okay, they might be living under an autocratic regime, but they are just people just trying to survive like we are, and that was a kind of feeling that I took forward right to.
And that takes us right up to 1992, summer of 1992, when you had the opportunity to go to um, a former territory of the Soviet Union, Siberia, Eastern, or was
Mm.
it Northeastern
Northeastern
Siberia?
Siberia. Yeah.
Right. And prior to that, that would have been impossible for you
Oh yeah.
to go to that area
Yeah.
because of the Iron Curtain. But um, you did have the opportunity to do that. You took a bunch of pictures. You have some of those pictures that you want to share with the people watching this right now. So I'm going to go ahead and share that, and you can give us a little tour of what post-Soviet era Russia looked like in 1992. Sound like a good idea?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. So go and find the relevant page. So can you see that all right? Is that coming up? Hello? Hello? Hiya. Hello?
Because I had my microphone muted. Sorry about that.
Okay, sorry.
So I could see, I was able to see what you were doing, but
Okay.
it went black, and then I wasn't sure if you were having some difficulties, and then you couldn't hear me, so I was.
No, I couldn't hear you at all. So I thought I'll put this one on
Okay,
for.
so here we go. We'll give it another try, real quick.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. So is that coming up?
Yeah, I can see the images now. Yes.
Okay. So this is the place that we ended up in, and this is about sort of 60 kilometers south of the Arctic Ocean, in a place called Chersky, which was a former polar research settlement. It was everything in that part of the world had to do with slave labor. It was all to do with the gulags. So there was nothing really there, that wasn't anything to do with the fact that the Russians, dumped all their political prisoners and people they didn't like in that part of the world. And Chersky had been built originally as just as a camp for people in the gulags, but it developed into a polar research settlement as a supply base, really, for the places out on the ice floes, the research stations. So you had aircraft like this that would go and supply them. And whilst that looks like a DC-3 Dakota, it's actually a Russian-built Li-2. The Russians got the license to build the Dakota before the Second World War, and then just built thousands of them for wartime use, but also they were quite useful for polar duties, and put a ski undercarriage on them, and they can land on the ice pack. So that's what they did. And of course, the river that you can see in the background there, that froze solid in the winter. So you didn't even need a runway. You could just land on the river when it froze. But they did actually build an airfield at Chersky, although it took about 15 years. There was a lot of trouble to try and actually build an airfield. They finally got it built in the mid 1950s. Might even later than that. It's a bit sort of sketchy as to how long it actually took. But the airfield that we landed on was like it had a proper hard serviced runway. It was actually a tarmac runway, but obviously with the kind of winter conditions they have out there, it breaks up quite a lot. So it was quite bumpy and it had been patched quite a lot. But in the town itself, which is you can see here just above the airfield, sort of just below on this little low cliff. But in the town, they had a preserved aircraft, and that was one of the ones that used to do the polar resupply flights. So we'll move on to something else. And these are some of the pictures I took on the way there. So in terms of Cold War jets, top left, you've got a Sukhoi Su-15 flag on. And to me, that was always one of the most beautiful of Soviet era aircraft. It just had those kind of lines about it that just screamed, kind of lethality and purpose. But the Su-15 was the type of aircraft that shot down the Korean airliner over Sakhalin, the one that strayed off course, and it crashed into the ocean with killing everybody on board. And because the Russians had caught it flying over Kamchatka, which at the time was one of the most heavily defended places on the planet, and they'd sent up jets to try and intercept this Korean airliner that had gone off course, and they couldn't catch it. They couldn't even find it to start with, apparently. They sent MiG-23s up after it, but they couldn't intercept it for some reason. And then they'd sent 4 of these Su-15s out after it. And one of them was ordered to close and then fire missiles at the 747, which he did. And apparently the story goes that if they'd missed with the missiles, then one of them was supposed to ram the 747. So, which was quite a story. It obviously caused quite a stink at the time that the Russians had downed a passenger jet. But their reason was that there'd been a lot of electronic intelligence aircraft from the American Air Force had been flying around just off the international kind of airspace, and they were worried that it was one of them, and so that's why they wanted to bring it down. And then you move over to the top right there, and there's a picture of a MiL-6 Hook. It's a heavy lift helicopter, and again, that's Russian Air Force, and they were used quite extensively during the Cold War to lift complete tracked missile systems, ballistic missiles launchers around, and other small vehicles as well. So, but you could get a tactical nuclear missile launcher in one of those. So that they were huge helicopters, but we saw quite a few of those out there. And then there's the workhorse MiL-8 helicopters. That's the orange one on the bottom right, bottom left, and that's at a very small airfield out in Siberia. And then on the bottom right, there's a whole line of Antonov 12 cargo aircraft at Irkutsk in Siberia. It's a major city out there, and these are pictures that you would never be able to get in the Cold War. But when the wall came down and people were allowed to travel out there, it was as if you were just in the West. You could almost do what you wanted. We took pictures without any restrictions whatsoever.
Oh yeah, go ahead and continue. I'm just listening to what you.
Oh, sorry. I didn't want to ramble quite a bit.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Have you got any questions about the images there?
No, we could sit here and talk about each of these photos like all night long, but I really want to give you the opportunity to go through it and share with us as much of the photos and experiences that you had, and then we'll do some questions at the end.
Okay. So what we'd do is we had a chartered aeroplane, and it was a one that had been used for spotting icebergs off in the Arctic Ocean. But it was effectively a passenger airliner, and we picked it up in Moscow and then flew to Siberia with it. And we had to leave it behind at one of the major airports, and then we got into a smaller airliner which we'd also chartered, and then we started flying between all these little strips, and most of them were gravel. but you land on when you're landing on a gravel strip in a turboprop airliner, and it was quite loud. But then we got off the airplane, and we were just free to walk around and just photograph the airplanes as much as we wanted. We could almost climb all over them. It was absolutely crazy. And I just remember thinking, am I really doing this? Am I really walking around an airfield in what was the Soviet Union just 6 months prior and doing this kind of thing without anybody coming to arrest me? And the picture of the Air Force helicopter there, I actually took that picture, and then as I took the picture, I heard all these clump of boots running across the tarmac, and there was 3 soldiers running towards me with Kalashnikovs with AK-47s like slung over them, and I'm thinking, oh, here we go, I'm going to be arrested. But they ran up to me and stopped, and they didn't draw the weapons. That they had big smiles on their faces, and I couldn't really work out what they were doing, and so they started saying, Ameriskansky, cigarettes, and they just wanted cigarettes. They wanted to trade for cigarettes. So they were ripping off buttons off their uniforms and taking the cap badges off, and they were trying to offer me these badges and to see if I had any cigarettes, and it was just crazy, absolutely crazy. I still look back at that now, and I've got this vivid memory of these 3 soldiers just kind of crowding around me, trying to see if I had cigarettes. But luckily, I'd been warned beforehand that it would be a good idea to take some packets of cigarettes with me, just to use as bribes, and they came in really handy that day. But the upshot was that they pointed to the helicopter, and I nodded, just saying, yeah, it's great. And one of them walked over and opened the door, and sort of often he said, do you want to go inside? I thought, okay, I'll do that. Yeah.
That's incredible. No, you're blowing my mind. It's almost as if you traveled into an alternate dimension, because this was literally probably 6 months after the
Well, it
collapse
was
of the
6 months.
Soviet
Yeah.
Union. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Because the Soviet Union had ceased to exist in December 1991, and I was at Novosibirsk, Siversky on the 1st of July 1992. So it
Yeah.
was literally 6 months and a day afterwards.
That is such a
And yet,
unique opportunity. That's an opportunity that now it seems almost obvious anybody could do that, right?
oh
But
yeah, sure.
but back then, just right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, um, how many people actually had the foresight to think about going and doing something like that?
Well, it was funny because the advert for the trip had only appeared in a couple of aviation magazines in the UK back in, I think it was either November or December the previous year, and I knew a few people who were enthusiasts in my neck of the woods in northern England, and yet nobody wanted to go. I don't know why. They were either frightened or they just couldn't afford it. There was definitely reasons why people didn't want to go, and I think they didn't have that foresight, as you said, to do this once in a lifetime opportunity. And yeah, I took it with both hands because I thought this is probably the only chance I'm going to get to go somewhere like that. Um, and it was just fantastic. So I got inside this helicopter, and it was pitch dark. I couldn't even take pictures because it was so dark. So I've got nothing from inside it, just this huge cavern inside, which was the cargo space. That's where I was in this helicopter, and I couldn't even find my way to the cockpit. And I remember just like sort of putting my hands out, trying to work out where the walls were of the cabin, but then just realizing there was this huge space, so you could and I've looked up afterwards to see what you could get in one of these. And you could get a couple of armored cars in, or a tracked missile system for like a Frog. I think it's like a Frog 7 like launcher, missile launcher could go into one of those. So it was enormous. But then again, they used them for lifting bits of pipeline around the Soviet Union as well, because the civilian ones that they operated in Siberia were used to exploit the gas fields and the oil fields. So they were quite useful workhorses. They weren't just military helicopters.
Incredible, man. Continue, please.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating experience.
Okay. So as we got to different airfields, and it was just a case of just go where you want, do what you want, take pictures of what you want. I think there was one place that we turned up that they turned around and said, well, you shouldn't really be going any further. And they wouldn't give us an idea why. They were getting quite nervous and were getting over one part of the airfield. And then somebody realized they could see the tip of a tail of an aircraft which didn't look as if it was in one piece. And it turned out to be a crashed airliner. And the airliner had made a diversion from a bigger airport nearby, and it had landed on this dirt strip as for an emergency landing. But it had been snow covered at the time, and because it had been in November when this airplane had crashed, and it had 189 people on board. It was an Illusion 62. It was quite a large airliner, 4 jets. Anyway, so it had landed on this snow-covered runway, but the pilot for some reason had touched down halfway along this really long snow-covered dirt runway, but he hadn't known. And then, of course, when he'd put the brakes on eventually and all the wheels had hit the ground, it was too late. He was about 100 feet from the end of the runway, and then it had gone off and over the snow and down a ravine, and the aircraft had broken up into 3 parts. So I've got a picture in the book that I wrote of this particular wreck, but everybody walked away from it. That was a crazy thing. And funny enough, I'd actually read about this story when it happened in at the time, and just thinking, oh, that's horrible. Little did I know that I would actually see this particular aircraft a couple of years later. It was crazy. But
Well,
yeah, our guide was really, really, really kind of like didn't want us to see it, But that was the only kind of trouble.
The thing that shocks me about it is that they just left it sitting there.
Oh yeah,
They didn't have the resources to go and clean it up and move it away from that location. But
we found that a lot. Yeah, we found that a lot. So there's probably two other stories I should just quickly mention in along that frame of reference. About 2 weeks before we landed at a place called Bratsk, which was halfway across Siberia, between Moscow and Irkutsk. We landed, but before we landed, the air traffic control were having a bit of a conversation with the pilots on the aircraft that we were flying in on, and we had an arranged stop at this airport to have a ramp tour, but there was clearly a conversation going on that they didn't want us to come in anymore, and we couldn't understand why. And the pilots, our crew, were a bit kind of nonplussed as to why this change of heart. But anyway, there was some conversation, and apparently the pilots had said, "Look, we've got a whole load of Western aircraft enthusiasts on board. If we don't land here, we're probably going to run out of fuel somewhere." So anyway, they did relent and they said, okay, we can land. When we landed, there was these 2 burnt tails of 2 Tupolev airliners sitting on the edge of the tarmac in front of the airport. And that was all. There was just the charred tail fins. The rest of the airplane was gone. And there was just a heap of ashes on the apron. And it turned out there'd been a refueling accident 2 weeks beforehand where the tanker driver for the fuel was drunk. And it's in the records. I think you can look it up. I have actually seen the accident report. And it turns out because he was drunk, he when they were doing the refueling, the actual engine that drove the pumps caught fire, and he wasn't quick enough to put it out. So the 2 aircraft, the one that he was refueling caught fire, and then the one that was parked right next to it caught fire as well. So it was this huge conflagration, and 2 aircraft just went up in smoke basically, and just the tails were left. And all they did was just bulldozed the bits off the parking area and left them on the side. And I've got pictures of these two tail fins, and they wouldn't tell us what happened. Our interpreter, who happened to be Hungarian but he could speak Russian, managed to find somebody on the airport to tell us what had happened, and all he could say was there was an accident. And I had to find out when I got home, years later, what had happened. So that was one story. And then the other one was we landed at this really obscure airfield out in North Eastern Siberia in the middle of nowhere. And when we landed, on one side of the aircraft, people could see this fuselage of an airplane, of another airliner just lying in the trees, just next to the runway. And when we got off the airplane, obviously everybody wanted to photograph it, so we did that. And there was somebody found out that much later that the airplane had cartwheeled in a snowstorm in 1976 and had crashed about 60 feet or so short of the runway. And all they'd done was just drag it a bit further down the airfield, and they just left it. So 1976 it had crashed. We saw it in 1992. But then again, these places were so remote that if anything went wrong, they couldn't really recover the airplane. They just left them in place. So there were wrecks all over the place. There were wrecks at airports, there were wrecks at airfields, there were wrecks in other places as well, and they just left them where they were. It was absolutely crazy. You would walk down a line of airplanes parked somewhere, and half a dozen of them might be active, but then the rest of them were just left to rot. And at one corner of an airfield somewhere, there would be a whole collection of helicopters or aircraft that were just missing bits, and they were just they were literally just left. It was
Now,
absolutely crazy.
I've never been to Siberia. I've heard stories of it. That's where the gulags were, where people
Mm,
were sent to basically to die in a work camp if they were
yeah, pretty
political
much. Yeah,
refugees or if they were criminals or whatever. They sent everybody out there.
that's right.
Uh, but what was it like when you were there? It was the summer, so was it still super cold?
Hot.
It was
It
hot.
was
Okay.
hot. So Siberia has this strange kind of temperature range. So some places in winter can go to minus 53 Celsius. It can go really cold, and then in summer you're looking at 30 35 sort of thing, plus 35, that is. And especially now that the temperature the temperature around the earth is going up. I've actually just written an article for the debrief about the so-called zombie fires, which seems to be a bit of a problem out there at the moment. The fires that basically don't go out during the winter, they just keep burning under the snow cover and then re-establish themselves when it comes to spring again. But back then, this is 92, and you can see from the pictures, it was quite sunny, and it was kind of t-shirt weather a lot of the time. There was only one place that we ended up at right after we'd left Chersk. We went even further north, off to the northwest, to a place called Chokadar, which was probably the most isolated place in the world I've ever been to. It was in the middle of a district which was probably about the size of Belgium, and it had 2,500 people living there, and most of them were living in this one town with an airfield which we landed at. And it was raining there, and it was probably the most miserable place on earth if that was the kind of weather, and it would be even worse in winter. I can't even think how people could survive there, let alone live and work there. But then again, back in the days of the Soviet Union, you used to get perks for living in that part of the world in Siberia. You would, I mean, on one hand, there'd be party officials who wanted to impress management, so they would go and volunteer to work out there. But the ordinary rank and file, if you were going to work out there, then they would get privileges. You get better pay. There'd be better housing, at least to start with. They were building all these kind of concrete, kind of apartment blocks, even in isolated Siberian towns and villages. So the standard of housing compared with some places in more kind of temperate Russia was a lot better. And of course then they had better paid jobs. And if they could stick it out for a while, then when they came back to sort of civilization, as it were, then they would probably advance up the ladder in terms of in terms of achieving things. So it was worth a lot of people's while to go and live and work in places like this. But that would be about the only way you'd get people to go and live out there.
The stories you were telling about the aircraft that were scrapped and just left to
Mm.
rot. It makes me curious to wonder if some of those aircraft are still sitting out there.
Oh, they are. No, they are. I mean, I haven't got pictures here because they're in the book, and I don't really want to spoil the kind of surprise. But there was a place we visited where they'd basically dragged some airframes from one airfield over a frozen river to an island and left them there. And they've been there since. Well, some of the airframes have been there since the 1970s, and they're never going to move. They're still there. You can still see them on satellite images today. So yeah, once they're there, they never leave.
So, do you have any more photos from your trip to Siberia?
Not for these ones, no. These are about the only ones I pulled out for the presentation.
Okay,
So
fair enough. But
I've just got some pictures of what I did.
you've been an
There's,
aviation
there's
enthusiast
one
since you were
thing I
young, then,
can't
yeah.
talk about if you don't mind. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I have done. Well, there's one just how far I travelled. So I think that's coming up there. There's a map of Siberia there. Is that shown?
Yeah, yeah, I see the map of Siberia, and it looks like you started
Yeah.
out in
So yeah,
Moscow.
so you can see the. Yeah, we did. Yeah, that's where we picked up the Ilyushin 18. So we travelled to Novosibirsk first, and then just went in stages, basically. So you can see where we ended up. But just going to give a little kind of taste of what the Cold War was like out this way, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
And I'm just
before
going to
before you do that,
just going to blow up. Oh, sorry.
yeah,
Go on.
I just wanted to ask you: Did you
Sorry.
was that whole route traveled through the air, or did you do any ground time?
No, it was all during the air. It was the only way to get out there quick enough that we had because our visas only allowed us to be in the country for, I think it was 12 days.
Mhm.
So we had to pack a lot in. And if we were going to go by train, well, you can't even, some of the places you can't even go by road anyway. So you could travel to Irkutsk, or even to Yakutsk by train and by road. But once you try to go northeast from Yakutsk, literally there's only one road in that part of the world. It's called the Doroga Kesti. It's called the English of that is the Road of Bones, and it's called that because they were built by the Gulag prisoners. And rather than bury people who died, they actually just put their bodies into the foundations of the road. So it's 2,000 kilometers long. It goes from Yakutsk to Magadan, and if you look on the map, the actual direct distance between those two cities is only about 1,000 kilometers. But this kind of track, if you like, was a gravel road. It snaked through the mountains, and it linked a whole load of isolated kind of mining camps and other places that were Gulag installations. Because as I said before, everything that was built out there was built because of the Gulags. So once that road is, and say it's a road, use the term loosely, it's the only way of transporting through that part of the world. However, they used the rivers that froze over in winter. They would use those as roads as well, especially to supply the towns along the rivers. So you could always connect that way, but that wasn't practical for us because we were there in summer.
Got it.
So we had to fly. Yeah. So once you could get to Yakutsk by surface, but from there to go anywhere else in Siberia, you have to fly. And that's the whole thing about that part of the world. Even in Soviet times, the focus was always on aviation, and everything was built because every community had an airstrip, or if it didn't, it was near one that did, and you could get there by boat. So so everything was focused around being able to fly people in and fly goods in. Even so much as the Polar Research Settlement that we were at, they had a flight that came in every day when it was during the Soviet Union. They brought fresh fruit and veg in. You know, they had a specific flight that came in and brought those kinds of supplies in because they couldn't grow that kind of thing up there. And obviously,
Yeah.
there was the only way to keep people living in places like that was to make sure that they were well looked after, and
Not
so they
even
were flown in.
potatoes.
So yeah, you can't. Well, there's no soil. It's peat. The permafrost, and it's frozen. You can melt the top layer by setting fires, but it'll freeze over quite quickly because it's permanently frozen. And there's not much kind of surface that melts, and it's certainly not soil that you can really grow in. So anything in. So it's a peculiar part of the world that you can't really grow kind of vegetables up that way, and well, they just wouldn't survive anyway. So it's everything had to be really flown in. You can catch fish, of course, up there and that kind of thing, but you can't really live on that kind of diet too well for too long. So yeah, they want to make sure that they looked after people who lived and worked out that way. And I'm sure that would be the same for a lot of the places up in the northeast as well, because Cherski wasn't in isolation. There was a string of places like that all the way along the north coast of Russia.
Yeah, that's a good reference to put that map in there because that gives people a little
Mm.
bit of a orientation of where you were and what it took you
Yeah,
to get out there. So, how many
yeah.
days were you
So
flying from Moscow to
well,
where you ended up?
well, so it was about five. It took about 5 days to get to the farthest point, um, and then we had 2 days out there, and then we slowly made our way back to Moscow by a few other places. So we were stopping in different places every day, apart from when we were at Cherski. We would say we spent 2 days up there, but just pop this up. So talking about how important aviation was to a place like Turkey, buildings, the apartment blocks that all these kind of little places still had, even in the middle of nowhere. They all had murals on the sides of the buildings. And I took a picture of this one, and that in Russian says in all parts of the world of the country, Aeroflot airplane. So it was just a reminder that they weren't forgotten. But all the different buildings had all these kind of propaganda messages on, showing them that that there was an air link, that they weren't isolated. But by 1992 they were, because the money had run out. The polar research basically ended with the end of the Soviet Union. They couldn't afford it anymore. So places like Cherski went backwards. People left because there wasn't the work anymore. So there was all kinds of reasons why these places went sort of deteriorated. And of course, when we were there in 1990, they weren't doing that anymore. The aircraft weren't being maintained. They weren't being looked after. They weren't being flown. So for us to turn up and look at the aircraft, it was a case of, why are you coming here to look at these aircraft that are just falling to bits? But we loved it. It was great. So there's a map there that just shows kind of like the immediate area, and you can see where it's flat. There's lakes all over the place. It's half water as well. It's just a weird country, and you can see there how close it is to the Arctic Ocean.
Yeah.
And then just a couple of things. Ambarchik is where the first circle is there, and that's the transshipment center for the Gulag prisoners. So rather than bring them over by land, which was impractical, they would actually bring them by ship over the Arctic Ocean from Murmansk. And then they would bring them to here because they couldn't get the big ships up the river. There was some kind of barrier at the mouth of the river, so they had to put them on barges. So this was a big tent, hutted enclosure of this Ambarchik place, and they would grade people, and they would find out if they had any special skills, so like engineers, or or they were just workmen, or they could just be used as. They were building all kinds of installations out that way. They were trying to build roads. They were building airfields back in the days of the gulags. War. But also they were trying to exploit mineral resources like gold and tin, diamond, and all that kind of stuff. So, they were in quite short supply. But then again, they were throwing thousands of ordinary people at these problems as well, just to build all this kind of stuff. And Cherski was a town that was built using slave labor, as was pretty much everywhere around there. And then one further thing, and this is definitely a Cold War object. There's no name there on the map, because that's for good reason. But this is a place called Aspidnoy, and we didn't even know this was there until I came home. And blow up there. That looks like an airfield.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is and it isn't. So the Russians had this thing that they had about 4 different types in the 60s and 70s, but they're only sort of centered around 4 or 5 different airfields. And the last thing you want is to have all your bomber assets in one place, because a couple of well aimed anymore. So they had all these dispersal airfields, except that's not an airfield. That's a flattened area in the tundra. Now, bearing in mind the tundra, when it melts, is a bog. If you try to land an aircraft on there, as soon as the wheels touch the ground, they'll rip off. So you can't land an aircraft on there, even though it looks like a runway. And it, so it looked like a runway, and then when it snowed and froze over, they could use it as an airfield. So the idea would be, in times of war, or war was threatened, then they would send the aircraft out to places like this, where they could then operate against America and Canada and Europe over the pole. And they called them bounce airfields. So they would disperse, 2 or 3 bombers to each of these locations. There are other ones around the Soviet Union, but this is the one that was sort of the one that was closest to what we knew. And this place even features on CIA reports from the keyhole spy satellites. So they could tell it was being used for practice. Except by about the sort of mid 1970s, then they realised that they just weren't bothering anymore. So there must have been a change of so that was quite interesting as well.
Okay, well, so we've got we'll go for about 30 more minutes,
Okay.
and there's a couple of other areas that I wanted to talk about before we close it down. Did you have um, any more photos and stories from that experience that you wanted to share, or did you want to move on?
I'll just move on if that's all right. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that.
Okay, so I remember looking at your slideshow. I I saw some of the early references to the movies um, that were pretty
Yeah.
influential in your life. Let's talk a little bit about that. I'm going to turn off the slideshow for a few minutes,
Okay.
unless you wanted to go through the slides to show those, and we'll
Yeah.
just
I'll leave them up if that's all right, because then I'll just talk about them each one by one. There's not much really to talk about in terms of influences, but they're certainly interesting films.
yeah.
So the first one is the Bedford incident, and it's got it's in black and white, but don't let that put you off. And it was made in the 1960s, and it's basically it could almost be a World War II story in terms of a destroyer hunting down an enemy submarine, except it's set in the Cold War. So you have those kind of undertones of it's going to turn out really badly if something goes wrong, because both the American ship, the American destroyer, and the Russian submarine that the American captain is trying to track off Greenland, both carry nuclear weapons. The American destroyer has nuclear-tipped ASROC anti-submarine torpedoes, and of course the Russian destroyer, they believe, has nuclear weapons. And it's one of those classic Cold War kind of standoffs when each side used to try and hunt each other's submarines and ships down, just for practice. Except this particular movie, the tension just gets ramped and ramped and ramped up. So you have a captain that just won't back down, and he has a former German U-boat captain from the war who's a special advisor on board, and he's not helping the situation. And then, of course, you've got Sidney Poitier, who's playing a correspondent for a newspaper, and he's on board as well. He's thrown into the mix, and he's the kind of everyman. He's the conscience of the film. And then, of course, he's straight away at loggerheads with the captain, Richard Widmark. And of course, it doesn't end well, but it's a fascinating study as to how things can spiral out of control really, really quickly with devastating consequences. So that's definitely one worth watching from the Cold War.
I'm adding that to my list because I haven't seen that one.
You haven't seen that one, okay?
No.
That's fair enough. Now, this one comes from the former Yugoslavia. Now, that's their name for it, RAT, but it may be known to some people under its English title, which is Atomic War Bride. And actually, it's a comedy, but it's got some serious undertones underneath it. So it's set in a fictional Eastern European country, and it's not, you can't determine where it is because it's all quite stylized. But essentially, it's the story of the couple getting married, but it's more than that because there's the threat of war behind it. And there's quite a funny scene in in the film, just to give one of the scenes away, where the town authorities come along with a whole load of trucks and have these kind of what they call anti-radiation capes with them, and they're giving them out to all the town's populace to wear because there's going to be an impending atomic bomb attack. So they're all trying to put these capes on to save them from radiation poisoning. But one chap, this old chap, gets one and it won't fit him. You can't pull it down over his head. So he's running around the town square trying to get underneath people's capes. But of course, they're only made for one person. And it's quite farcical, really. This guy running around trying to find somebody who will either give him a cape or let him share. But it just goes on from there. Anyway, there's jets flying overhead and there's threat of war, then war happens. And that's when it really takes a kind of a downward turn, the film. It's quite depressing at the end, and it shows the kind of aftermath of an explosion. But it's a really, really powerful film, and it's got quite a good anti-war message in it. But that's another one that people probably haven't seen either.
Yeah, I've never even heard of that one.
Okay, so that's Atomic War Bride, it's called. And it's actually, you can find it on YouTube as well if you want to look that way for it. And then this one's called, it's a Russian, it's a short film. It's only about 7 or 8 minutes long, and it's called Conflict, and it was made in 1983. And you can imagine it's the war of the matches, basically. So it starts with it's a kind of stop motion animation, and it's basically, you start off with a box of matches, and all the matches spill out, but some of them have got blue heads and some of them have got green heads. So, and then there's a border is drawn between them. So it's obviously a parable for the two sides of the Cold War. And then you just see this conflict between the two sides escalate, and again, it doesn't end well for either side. And it's that kind of mutually assured destruction theme that was quite prevalent back then. And coming from the Russian side, that was for me, when I first saw this film in the late 1980s, it was quite powerful. And I just thought, yeah, they think the same as us. I was saying before about I was wanting to find out a little bit how the ordinary Russians felt, and when I saw this short film, I just thought, yeah, they're frightened as much as we are.
Yeah. Although I think prior to the 80s, you would have been hard pressed to see a movie like this get out to the public.
Oh, sure.
From within that regime, because those hardliners, when Gorbachev came into power, he was really bent on changing things, and I think he was really scared of Ronald Reagan, but he also admired him greatly. So
That's right, they did.
Yeah, he was really started to move in a direction of ending the Cold War. But up until that point, you had these hardliners that were so oppressive and so, trying to control everything, every mode of communication was just very, very controlled by the government, I guess, if you want to call them that. But movies like this, you don't see a lot of prior to the 80s.
No. So Conflict is available on YouTube as well. You can look it up and see it for yourself. So it's definitely worth seeing. It's only 7 or 8 minutes long, so it's not a huge length of time to sit and watch something, but it's very powerful, I felt. And then just a couple more. So By Dawn's Early Light, I'd actually read the book that this was based on. There was a book called Trinity's Child that I read when I was a teenager, and I realized at some stage in the 1980s it was made into a movie. I think it might have been a TV movie. I'm not entirely sure it had some kind of cinematic release, but it's the story of a B-52 mission to attack Russia after the Third World War starts, and it was quite chilling in its own way in terms of how a nuclear attack would unfold in real time. It has a kind of a rather stylized way of doing it in terms of there's a power grab between the president who goes missing and his successor, who turns out to be a hawk and who just wants to continue the attacks even when it's futile. But yeah, there's some interesting set pieces in this film. So yes, that was another one that was quite powerful. But I'd read the book beforehand, so I knew what to expect. And the book's slightly different, but all the essential elements are there, and they're both worth either reading or watching. And then the other one is this one. Now, the War Game was made in 1965, and it was made in Britain. I don't know whether have you heard of this one?
I've seen it.
You've seen it, right? So
Good movie.
it was banned. Yeah, it was. But the thing was, it was banned by the BBC before it was shown, because I thought it was too difficult to show it to audiences. It was too violent. It was too graphic. It got a very limited cinematic release in Britain in about half a dozen different cinemas, and it was only for a few months, and then they pulled it. They didn't show it until the 1980s on British TV, and I think it might have even been after Threads was shown that they showed this. And this was the story of a nuclear weapon, a missile that was aimed at an airfield in Kent and in southern England, but it had missed and it had overshot by 10 miles, according to the description in the film. And this was the aftermath. And it shows the lead up to it, and then what happened afterwards. And it was the bits where these little scenes where they were trying to make sure that the survivors could live in other people's houses because their own houses had been destroyed. So it was almost like refugees being accommodated by families, but at a point of a gun. So the police would come around and say, right, you've got to take these people in. And then there was pictures of food riots and a traffic warden, somebody who would stop people parking on the street, and he was given a rifle and he was acting as police. And all those little bits, just like, to me, would very, very chilling. It may not sound, when you're talking about them like now, they don't sound like much, but back in those days when you were watching it, it was something else entirely.
And also, watching a movie like that, knowing that the potential for something like that to happen was a real potential. Not and
Yeah,
it was an everyday threat. It wasn't
that's right.
like nowadays. People don't really think about nuclear arms race because it's not in the news all the time.
No.
But back in the 80s, and what a lot of people don't understand is that during the 80s there were some really peak moments of tension between the Soviets and the Western allies.
That's right.
It wasn't as maybe as tense as you would think of during the Korean War, or the Vietnam War, or even oh man, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes, very true.
But it was a continuous buildup, and there was like the Korean airliner that was shot down.
Mm.
That happened, and the Iran uh, hostage crisis happened,
Yes,
and then
lots of flashpoints.
the bombing in Beirut. There was all these things that were leading up to a potential flashpoint, and and then you have movies like this coming out portraying what it would be like after a nuclear exchange happened.
Yeah.
And so it was pretty sobering to see some of these
I mean,
movies like The War Game.
I remember seeing The Day After, and that was the American kind of take on the experience, or what the supposed experience was like. And I just remember comparing them. And the thing about The War Game was that it was a very, looked like a very realistic documentary. You could also almost imagine it was telling a story that had already happened by the
Yeah.
way it looked. Whereas to my mind, The Day After was some kind of a dramatic kind of telling of something that might happen, with some kind of very sort of homey kind of little experiences, the kind of relationships and all the rest of it that were in it. Whereas this was just quite gritty and
Yeah.
quite real, and obviously it was in black and white as well. So it looked, from the time, it just looked like they were telling the story of something that had already happened, and it was very, very. Oh, it just went right through you in terms of how its impact, and then interspersed with the images with all these little bold statements in terms of this is what will happen, and there would be a few lines of text about how many people had died and
That's right. I forgot
the
about that.
casualties and all the rest of it, and they were just interspersed all the way through the film. And that brought home quite a lot of it as well, because it was, it wasn't sugarcoating any of it. It wasn't, softening it for the audience. It was just saying that's what it'll be, and then here's this, and you were just getting hit one thing after another, and it just was just like wave after wave of information and images, and it was it was overpowering, and I
Yeah.
can understand why the BBC pulled it at the last minute and didn't show it at the time, because it would have frightened people. And clearly, that's not what they wanted. They wanted to inform people. They didn't want to frighten them. They just wanted to make sure they knew what was happening. But they couldn't show it at the time. That our country wasn't ready for it. I mean, there's something I like to think back from then, because a lot of influences that we had in Britain at the time, we were still fighting the Second World War in many respects in terms of our media, in terms of the films that were shown, the TV that was shown, the books that were being released. We weren't talking about what was going to happen. We were still one foot firmly in the past. This changed that kind of thing, but they still wouldn't show it.
Yeah. Did you have any more movies that you wanted to talk
No,
about?
that was the lot.
Okay,
So
good.
that's just a bit there where it says
Good
it was
deal.
made in 1965, withdrawn by the BBC, not shown until 1985. So a long time afterwards.
Yeah, there were a couple of really good movies. You mentioned Threads, another good, very sobering
Mm.
movie, very graphic. Um, so let's change gears and talk a little bit about your interest in another topic. Um, unless you had something else you wanted to say about the Cold War, I
No,
think
that's perfectly fine.
we've covered that in quite a bit of depth, and
Happy to move on.
yeah. But I'm also happy to talk about the Cold War. I just want to give a little bit of time to talking about UFOs and what
Mm.
got you interested in that topic.
Okay.
So, did you have slides that you wanted to share on
Yeah,
that
I'm just
topic
going to
as well?
pop one up.
Okay. I think everybody recognizes that particular slide.
I'm sure they will. So, obviously, that's the thing that's kickstarted a lot of it of people's interests at the moment. However, mine started a lot earlier. So, that's how far back I go to. I was about 9 year old, and this book caught my interest in a bookshop. And even at 9, I was reading, books that didn't have pictures in them. I was quite a voracious reader, and I'd already realised that you could read, books that were informative rather than just entertaining. And I'd read 2000, the short story that inspired 2001 by that time. So I was into science fiction. And I saw this spacecraft on the front of this book, and I thought, okay, this looks interesting. Is it another science fiction book? And it wasn't. It was purporting to be about real events. And Brinsley Poet Trench was actually the Earl of Clancarty. He was a British from the British nobility, and he sat in the House of Lords in the UK government. But he was interested in UFOs. And now, looking back to this book, it was a bit of everything. There were some UFO reports, but there was a lot of stuff about biblical encounters as well, and some bits about contactees from the 1960s. So it was a bit of a hodgepodge of everything. But it certainly sort of struck a chord with me about what might be out there that we don't know about. So that was what got me started. But by that time, I was watching Star Trek. Star Trek was shown on BBC One in the UK at prime time, in mid-evening, 7:25 in the night, on a Monday night, on the main BBC channel. So, and people forget that it was actually quite a popular show back then, even in the UK. And I used to watch that at that time, so I was obviously primed to get interested in this kind of thing. And I was a curious child. I was always into asking questions and wanting to learn more about things I was interested in. So I always thought it was a logical assumption to think, yeah, we're not the only civilization, inhabited planet in the universe. What else is out there? Who else is coming to visit us? And of course, that was the thinking at the time. Now, having said that, with a few notable exceptions, ufology used to be, well, it was restricted to American researchers, or at least so I thought. At least the information that I had access to. The books that they were producing, were of variable quality. That there was the good ones, by the good authors, were lasting impression, whereas there was also a gamut of really poor ones as well that just seemed to be published just to get people money, and I felt like I'd wasted pocket money buying these. But I was living in a provincial part of England. I didn't know people who were interested in the subject. I couldn't find anybody to talk to about it. The internet didn't exist then, so you couldn't really contact people. The books themselves that I bought didn't really have contact details for the UFO groups either. So it wasn't a case of being able to get into the subject that way. So all I could do was just read the books I could find. I couldn't even work out which ones I had to steer away from that were just talking gibberish. So it was just a case of, oh, there's a book about UFOs. Yeah, I'll buy it, I'll read it, and I'll just soak the information up. One of the ones that did strike a chord back then was John Keel's Strange Creatures of Time and Space, which I think is quite expensive on eBay nowadays. And it covered everything. It covered things from lake monsters to succubuses and incubuses and UFOs and hairy dwarves and all the rest of it. But that was quite illuminating. And then, of course, there was Eric von Daniken, who was quite a big thing back in the 1970s with these ancient astronaut books. Long before Ancient Aliens was a thing on the television, he was selling millions of books about the chariots of the gods. And the BBC got in on the act because they had a documentary that I saw at the time that featured all the lines in the desert in Peru and these strange artifacts that I think they found in Colombia that looked like gliders and all the rest of it. And he was putting together a story that yes, the aliens had visited us in the past. So I mean, somebody who was 7 or 8 years old, or 10 years, 11 years old, or whatever I was at the time, it was like, wow, it was I was just lapping it up. It was great, So I mean, I wasn't probably old enough to question it. I was soaking it up like a sponge. Obviously, the kind of questioning and the reevaluation came later. But I think looking at the work I'm doing at the moment, because I'm working on a book on the so-called Foo Fighters from World War II, because I was interested in airplanes, and actually when I was younger, I was more interested in the World War II aircraft, and more importantly, the German aircraft, and also German missiles and tanks and all that kind of stuff. I got to know in about 1982, I bought a book on German jet aircraft. And there was a section in the back about something called Project Saucer. So the book described these 3 flying disc projects that the Germans were supposed to develop during World War II. And that blew my mind. It was, hold on, we're being told that flying saucers are aliens. And yet here's this book telling me that the Germans built them. So, I'm being derailed here. And my thinking from about 9-year-old had been that they were coming from outer space, and now I'm being told that they're German. So what do I think? So that got me thinking quite a bit as well, and I tried to find out more information. But obviously, the pre-internet age, you haven't got access to a computer. You've only got your local library, and they're usually pretty, especially in where I live, they were pretty limited in the scope of the books that you had access to. The bookshops in the centre of Newcastle where I lived didn't have that much of a range either. So my kind of ability to find out much more on the subject was quite limited. So it had to be put on the back burner for a while. But even back then, I was interested in the nuts and bolts of ufology, the craft, and what kind of capabilities it would have. And that came from my taste in science fiction, because I wasn't one for fantasy novels. And I'm probably going to come out with something which is totally blasphemous here, but I didn't really like Star Wars. I wasn't a Star Wars fan. I was a Star Trek fan, because Star Trek had spacecraft, and they talked about.
I think we're losing connection, Graeme.
Sorry.
I'm just teasing you because you don't like Star Wars and I love Star Wars.
Yeah, you really had me going there.
Because we have had some issues, but I've been a huge Star Wars fan since I was 10, 11 years old.
I'm gonna obviously just try and redeem myself, because initially I didn't watch it when it first came out. I know it came out in '77. I saw all the first three films together in about 1982 when the third one came out. And that's when I finally got into it. But beforehand, I was quite, I don't know, what the phrase would be, but I was quite reluctant to get onto it because I had this thing because my friend's force, and it was something that could magically wave away any kind of problems. And I just thought that's a bit kind of cheap. If you want to solve a problem, just wave something about or just think something and it'll happen. And I just thought, nah, that's lazy. So that's why I stayed with Star Trek. And because Star Trek was about spacecraft and phasers and transporters, all this kind of physical stuff that I could appreciate. Whereas Star Wars was more about a kind of feeling and about magic to me. And that was something I was never really into. So, and I know better now. And I do appreciate those original Star Wars films much more now. But back then I wasn't. But I think parallel to that was when I was interested in UFOs. I couldn't get my head around the contactee movement from the 1960s and the 50s, sorry, that when people were saying, "Oh, I've been contacted by aliens and they're saying that I should say this, and I've got a message for the planet," and to me that just sounded like people in search of a quick book that were getting people to sign up to newsletters or to buy their books. They were just, well, what was that thing they used to have in America? The rainmakers, weren't they? They would turn up in a town that didn't have any water, didn't have any rain, and they said, "Oh yes, we'll make it rain. Just give us some money." So it was all that kind of. There were charlatans, and I still
Well,
have a little bit of that at the moment.
so let me ask you right now,
Mm,
on that specific topic,
mm,
the abduction and the contactee phenomenon, or
mm.
I would say that's
Well,
that's a serious part of the phenomenon.
it
Uh,
is, yeah.
what are your thoughts on that?
So I have to discriminate between the contactees and the abductions because there are two separate things. The contactee thing is the ones where space aliens pick somebody to give them a message, and I have a hard job sort of dealing with that. I can't doubt people saying that this happened to them because I wasn't there and I didn't see it, and it may well have happened for all I know. But I'm just, again, I have a hard job grasping it. The abduction thing is something completely different. I've got no frame of reference with that, and I can't dismiss it out of hand like a lot of other things in the UFO experience because I haven't experienced it for myself. It's almost impossible to put myself in the view in the kind of in the minds of people who are saying these things, and they clearly believe it, and under hypnosis they're coming out with these experiences and these memories that have been repressed, and there's something to it. What that something is a different question entirely. But there is clearly enough, I wouldn't say evidence, but certainly information out there that to point people in the direction there's clearly something going on. But as I say, I have no idea what it is.
That's interesting. No, I want to backtrack a little bit
Hmm.
further and ask you from the early days when you first discovered UFOs and what you
Hmm.
thought they were, and then later on as you started to look at some different literature
Yeah.
and you realized that it could potentially be something different, and that's an interesting comparison um, to uh, the different types of phenomena that are out there. But where do you fall now? Is it do you think that it's more a man-made craft that is just being covered up, or do you think that it's something else not human-made, or is it both?
Do you know? I have no idea. That's my default position on a lot of this. I simply do not have an idea, have a clue, because George Knapp has you'll have heard of George Knapp. He has a phrase that he comes out with occasionally. It says, "The more I learn, the less I understand," and that's something I really do subscribe to. There's just so much information that you can't almost take it all on board. And just as when you think you have a handle on part of it and you have an understanding, then something else comes, a bit more information comes along, and it just resets you. That you're back to square one. And every time I think I have a kind of idea about what's going on with something, I mean, just take for instance these three FLIR videos that came out in 2017. I had an idea at the time. I thought, oh yes, okay, they look like what they're purported to be. And then people come along and say, oh, there might be this. And then you start thinking, okay. And then you go back to it, and then you just keep kind of going backwards and forwards between different scenarios and think, okay, it could be this. My kind of thinking on the FLIR videos is that there's definitely something to it. And I don't think they're something prosaic like drones, foreign adversary technology, or even American super secret technology. But that's just my feeling. I don't have any information to base that opinion on. That's just a gut feeling, but it's based on information I've read, and heard from others. But that's all I can base that opinion on, because I don't have access to information that would tell me anything else. Then this is information that's been coming out recently about the American destroyers that have been surrounded by drones, the USS Kidd in 2019. And the stories about that and the information that's coming out about that particular vessel and the way that they were surrounded by drones, but also not just that vessel, but other vessels in the formation, in the group of ships, that's intriguing as well. And you just think, okay, there's definitely something going on. But then today on Twitter, there's a whole load of posts going on about, I think there may be Chinese drones, that they may have leapfrogged us in technology. And you can't dismiss it. You can sort of think, no, it can't be that. And you can come up with a whole load of reasons why. But at the end of the day, we don't know enough to say, it's definitely not this. It's definitely this, or it's something else. We can have a good go at saying, yeah, this is why we think it's this because X, Y, and Z. But actually, we don't know. We're not the people who are making the decisions. We're not the people who have the access to all the facts. So
Okay,
we're making it. Sorry, go on.
let me change gears just a little bit on you and ask you a little bit of a maybe an easier question to answer. Okay,
It's all
so
right.
so there is a report coming out in, well, supposedly it's supposed to come out in June, but it'll probably be
There is.
delayed.
Yeah.
And it's going to give the public some information. Now, there's some controversy whether or not it's going to be anything
Yeah.
groundbreaking. For the public, I think the public is going to get something out of it, but I don't know that the community, the UFO community at large, is going to be that impressed with it. That said, hypothetical, okay?
Hmm.
If that report comes out and says these are not human made craft, they are, uh, I know this wouldn't happen, but just saying what if, okay? The big
Yeah.
what if in the alternate universe where the government comes out and it's completely transparent, they say we have uh, the crashed debris, we have the bodies, and these things are not anything that we've ever seen, and we don't think that they're from this planet. What
Hmm.
does that do in your mind? What does that do to the world?
Well, if you'd asked me that a few years ago, I would have thought it would have transformed the way that we live and then we think about ourselves, our place in the universe, and where do we go from here. The way that social media and the media themselves and people generally go on with their lives nowadays, I'm frightened that people will just think it's some kind of fake news and that they're doing it for some kind of agenda. And I'm not entirely sure that everybody on the planet will take it as seriously. Let's say if that kind of scenario happened, that everybody would take it as seriously as they probably would otherwise. People would be looking for it as an angle as to why are you saying this? What are you trying to deflect from? Are you trying to hide something else? Why are you saying this? And that might just be my cynical, 54-year-old self saying that, but it's a different world nowadays. I'm not entirely sure we were even ready for this kind of announcement. And that's probably, again, probably quite a blasphemous statement from somebody, especially who's interested in the topic and who wants disclosure. It may be a case that we need to, the general public, I mean, not UFO enthusiasts, but the general public needs to be a bit, primed a bit more before this kind of information is suddenly, sort of dropped on them, for want of a better phrase. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I have to agree with you. I think that there would be a large swath of the population that would think that it's fake news. Um,
because also it would depend on who was saying it. So if Joe Biden suddenly announces it, then maybe the people on his political opponents who have see an opportunity to have a go at him, or the population at large who don't agree with his policies might think, oh, just dismiss it out of hand, or may criticize him because they're shooting the messenger. If it had happened under Trump's watch, then people would maybe not believe it for that reason as well, because it was coming out of his mouth. So you've got that to take into consideration. So
Okay, that's a
like some
fair
kind of
point,
spacecraft landing on the
but
White House lawn,
there have been several people in the intelligence community that have come out recently and said that these are these are potentially something that is not human made.
Oh yeah,
So,
that's true.
and those are bipartisan. Those people
Yes.
are bipartisan. They're not one side or the other. So, the if you take the political turmoil out of it,
Mm,
and whoever the administration is that comes out and says it is going to have to deal with that fallout. But I think at the ground level, the majority of people are going to eventually come to realize that this is a true story. What what's being and again, we're living in an alternate universe. This is a hypothetical. So the government comes out transparency, with disclosure, and they start offering the technology to be studied by the scientific community, that kind of stuff. Um, I would like to believe that it changes our culture, our civilization for the better eventually, because I'm an optimist. I believe that irregardless of how bad things get, right now we're in a pretty rough time with COVID.
mm,
On the other side of this, I think that things are going to be better than we could imagine. I honestly believe that we're going to have a new age of enlightenment, if you want to call it that, which what we had after the Dark Ages in the medieval times. Um, I I think that technology, medical advancements, artistic advancements is going to, like you said, leapfrog, uh, and be we're going to be in a different world within 5 years.
yeah. I'm an optimist in that, in so much as I agree with everything you've just said there. But the pessimistic side of my nature sort of think, I just look at what's happening at the present. I mean, I can't say what the coverage is like in the States in terms of everyday newspaper and TV coverage of the UFO issue, apart from the interviews that you mentioned before. But in terms of the British side of things, yeah, there's nothing. You get occasionally there'll be a web article on one of the major newspaper sites, but there's no traction on the BBC channel, on the major news network. And they've got a 24-hour news channel, but there's no time devoted to that. But then again, they're too busy talking about COVID, and that's understandable because that's immediate, that's here now, and that's something that people can appreciate because it's affecting their everyday lives. Whereas the UFO issue is something harder to break into because it's more ephemeral. It's a what if to a lot of people. It's not. It's something that either isn't real or is a hoax or is something mundane. And even when they do think about it in terms of, well, actually, it could be something else, then there's just doesn't seem to be the capacity for people to actually reach beyond that kind of threshold in terms of there's actually something to this, beyond people like yourself and everybody else out there on UFO Twitter. But so I don't see that from this side of the pond. From our media, we've got a long way to go before there's some serious kind of engagement. Now, there are people who are trying to change that, and there are people on UFO Twitter who are doing so. You've got people like Adam Gulsack from UAP Media UK. He's really, really trying to move the media's focus across here in that direction to get them engaged in the stories. There are people, no doubt, in the States who are doing exactly the same thing.
You know
Um,
what? That's a
so,
good
but it's a
point.
slow
I'm sorry to
process.
interrupt you right now, but bring up that poster of the big phone home. We'll go ahead and post that while we're talking about this,
Okay.
because
Yep.
that's a good. Um,
I'll find that.
a good place to talk about the April 24th push
Yeah.
for
So
disclosure. That's because
yeah. So
that's in the UK and the US as well.
well, yeah, and it's actually all over the world. I mean, I guess it started off in America because of the way it's scripted there, but it applies equally. It doesn't matter where you live on the globe, because this kind of issue does affect everybody. If there is something, to this, then it's not just America centric or Russia centric or Chinese centric. It's the UK, it's France, Israel, you name it, it's everywhere. And reports are from all over the world about this. So it doesn't matter where you live. Your representatives, whoever they are, and whatever kind of government it is, you know, either need to be engaged or need to know that the public are wanting to know the answers to questions, and therefore it's behind all of us to actually get in touch with them and say what's going on. You know, bring it to their attention, because they themselves may not be either aware of what's going on or not interested. But if they know their voters are, then they may do something about it.
So talk a little bit about what is the big phone home.
So
I'll let you go ahead and talk about
no,
that.
that's fine.
I'm gonna
Bearing in
share a
mind, yeah,
tweet
bearing
out
in
with.
mind, sorry, bearing in mind, I'm not actually directly engaged in it in terms of setting it up, but I am subscribed to it. So April 24th, people are encouraged to either email, telephone, or even write, if that's your persuasion, to their local representative. So in the states, it'd be presumably your congressman or whatever, whoever your local representative is. In the UK, it's your member of parliament to wherever you live, and it's basically to ask about what is happening in terms of UFOs, in terms of unidentified aerial phenomenon, as we have here, the phrase UAP that's now bandied about. And it's basically just to get people aware there's something going on, and we want to know why and what's happening. So in terms of what's happening in the States, there's clearly an issue because these objects, for want of a better phrase, are being seen in proximity to carrier battle groups. Well, there's a problem straight away. If you've got something that's flying around a US Navy exercise or a bunch of ships, that's a defense issue. If they're flying around military exercises, that's another defense issue. If they're flying around strategic weapons installations such as nuclear missile launch sites or nuclear power plants, well, that's another defense issue. So surely that's got to be something that the government are interested in. So why aren't they saying more about it? So it's basically a way of just saying, look, there's an issue here. We want to know more about it. What can you tell us? How can you get engaged? How can you then bring discussions into the people who make the decisions in power to talk about it more? And it's just a way of getting information out of them. But the people really to actually find the information from as to what you do is based on the website there, which is www.thebigphonehome.com.
Right.
And they you can get signed up there, and you can find out. They have templates of the emails that you can send to your local representatives, so you can see
Emails,
the wording.
letters.
Yes, so you can see the actual wording of what is being sent. And actually, the best way to do it is to get a hold of those and maybe even tailor them to your own specifications, so they don't just seem like it's a mail shot.
And it is getting some traction,
Oh, it is.
both in the UK and the US. There's
That's
quite a
right.
few people, and Luis Jimenez
Yes,
is the one who kicked this off, and he's pushing, or he's leading the charge for this.
he is. Yes.
But he's commissioned this poster and put the some of the names of the people that are involved in the event leading up to the 24th. And there, if you look at that website, you'll learn a lot more about it. You can get involved yourself. Everybody who's interested in learning more about the UAP UFO topic, from and finding out what the government has to say about it, is encouraged to go check out this website, do whatever is recommended on the website, because it's all done legally, it's all done diplomatically. We're using we're exercising our rights as citizens of the respective countries that
Mm.
are participating, and we're just applying pressure on the government to release the information and let us
That's
in
right.
on the conversation.
I think the only thing I'd say is just be polite when you do it as well. Don't demand things. Just ask nicely. You find you get a lot more that way. And put the reasons even why that you're doing it for. Don't just send a bold statement out, just saying we want to know this, we want to know that, but put the reasons down why it's important that your
Well,
political
the nice part
representatives
about
are
this
involved.
is that there's very little thinking that needs to go into it.
Mm,
You're basically encouraged to download the pre-formatted letter, read it, of
mm,
course, sign it, and send it. And then on or before the 24th, call into your representatives, your Congress members,
that's right.
and ask them verbally exactly what it is you want. And it's all scripted out. It's all the thinking has already been done.
Yeah,
So if
that
it's a
makes it
concerted
easier.
effort, yeah,
It makes it easier for a lot of people. It's also worth looking at the history of your local representative as well to see what they've been engaged in the past. So if they've had any connection with defence issues, there've been any kind of ministers of defence or had a responsibility for that kind of thing, then that's something that you can ask about as well and reference the fact that they were or are involved in that sphere. My member of parliament in the UK at the moment was a former minister of the armed forces um, uh, some years ago. So my particular email to her will actually reference that. So it's a bit more personal. So it's rather than just coming through as just a kind of copy and paste email to my MP will be actually will be slightly changed so it has a bit of a bit more direct focus.
that's
So hopefully
encouraged.
that'll get some kind of engagement going there.
That's absolutely encouraged as well. But
Yeah.
it's also it's for people. The pre-formatted letter is for people that don't really want to put a lot of thought into
Oh
it. They
no, no,
just want to
it
contribute and
that's true.
participate.
Yeah, it covers the wide spectrum. So there'll be people who simply wants to, as you say, cut and paste it and send it off, and that's great because it
People
gets that
like
volume.
you that are more like direct activists, which is what I would classify you as, an activist. Um, y- you're going to put the extra effort in, and
Mm.
like you said, do some background on your um, what are they called, ministers?
We have, well, if they're in the government in the cabinet, they are ministers. Yes, otherwise
Yeah.
they're members of parliament.
Okay, part of it. Yeah, it's a little bit confusing because I'm not that familiar
No,
with
that's
the way
fine.
it's
Yeah, yeah. I don't
structured over
understand your system entirely either, so don't worry.
there. Yeah. But the biggest takeaway of this whole effort is that it's a group, concentrated effort for as many people as possible
Mm,
to let the governments know that we're interested in learning more about this topic.
that's right.
And like you said, it's not a demand; it's a request.
No.
But they are our representatives,
Mm.
so
But I
they
think
do
also
have
it's
to we do have to hold them accountable for what we want out of
we
them.
do. And also when it comes around to election time, they know they have to have our support. So it's always worth letting them know that people are out there, actually are watching what they say and do. It's not just political representatives either. However, having said that, we're also there's from what I can see, there's an attempt to try and get journalists on board as well. People in the media. So that's obviously worth doing. Now, I mean, I'm not as much as an activist in terms of subject as some people are, especially on that list that we've got there. But we all do our part. So, even somebody just downloading, as you say, downloading the email or the letter from the website is more than enough. It's better than doing nothing.
Well, I'm gonna. That's a good message to leave it on, and I really want to wind this down. Let you get some
Hmm.
sleep tonight before if you have to get up and go to work tomorrow. But
No,
before I
I am
go,
off tomorrow.
we covered a huge amount of information tonight. But why don't you just give me real quick your final thoughts, closing comments, and then how
So,
can people contact you?
Yeah, okay. So it's an exciting time. I mean, there's a lot of anticipation for this this report that's going to come out in June, if it comes out at all. So yes, it's very exciting. However, it's not entirely certain that it'll have any useful information. And I think people have to be realistic and just manage their expectations at the moment, that we may not get what we want when we want it and in the format we want it. So people don't be too disappointed if it doesn't meet your expectations. We should be happy that it's been discussed to start with. And if we from when the UFO issue it realistically started, it's going to be some time yet, I think, before anything really emerges that's solid. But we're going in the right direction. There's people out there who are working towards this. They're doing a hell of a lot more than I am. But everybody who talks about it, everybody who writes about it, everybody who reads other people's work, they're all contributing towards that sense of momentum to push things in the right direction and to get it into the eyes of people who can do something about it. Because people outside government, we can only put pressure on them. The people inside the government, they're the people who can make the decisions. So yeah, so that's really what I'd like people to take away from this, is that yes, there's a sense of optimism here, but just temper it a bit. Just think, well, yeah, we'll be happy with what we can get at the moment, and then we'll build upon that if and when the time comes. If there's more than that, that's brilliant.
Absolutely. Yeah, good closing thoughts. Now, I tried to bring up your book on. This will try one. There we go. Okay, so this is your book. How can people get this book? And if they want to reach out to you, how can they contact you?
Okay, so the book's available on Amazon only at the moment. So there's an ebook and a softback version which just come out. So if you search for my name on Amazon, you'll find it. There's also links via my website, which is mentioned there, which is www.reivacountryBooks.com, and that's Reiva spelled Reiver. That's a reference to the cross-border raids in the part of the world I live in. It's a historical reference. But Reiva Country Books is all one word. Or you can email me at reivacountrbooks@gmail.com, and I can give you the details from there. But searching for my surname on Amazon is the best way. It'll pop up straight away.
Okay, and you're on Twitter.
I'm on Twitter, yes, at Borders750.
Great, good deal. And then you mentioned a book that you're working on now about Foo Fighters
I
during
am,
World War
yes.
II. Do you have
So
a title
yeah,
for that and
I don't.
estimated?
Okay, I don't have a title for it yet. It's still a work in progress. I'm about 160,000 words into it at the moment, at about 450 pages, and I'm still not finished yet. I'm sort of winding down in terms of how much information I can actually physically and realistically get into the book. But I've got a few more things to find. At the moment, the official records in this country are impossible to obtain if they're not able to be downloaded, and there are some files I need for the book which I have to request physically. So the National Archives in the UK won't be open for that until the end of the month. So I can't get that information till then. So the book's not going to be available until probably at least the summer at the earliest, and maybe a little bit later. But I'm going through it as quick as I can.
Would there be any records available in other countries like France, Germany, Austria?
Funny thing is, Germany would be the ideal source, but there aren't. There are very few reports in terms of what the Foo Fighters were in Germany. Both sides seemingly thought that they were each other's secret weapons.
Hmm.
Certainly, that was the thing on the American and the British side. Not as clear cut on the German side. There's anecdotal evidence that the Germans thought they were Allied secret weapons, but it's very hard to pin down sort of accurate information on that. And in terms of the cases which have been published since about the 1950s, some of them are complete hoaxes, and others don't sort of have enough information to be able to corroborate them. And I've done my best in quite a few of the cases to try and work out exactly what's going on. But I'm not very far forward, and the German records simply don't exist. There was a lot of records in the war that were lost, and in certain time frames, the records were destroyed, especially near the latter months of the war, in the kind of chaos and the confusion of the 1945. So that information's been much harder to obtain, and I've still got some feelers out for some other things, but in terms of that, but it's very slow progress.
Well,
In terms of the
if
American and British, sorry, in terms of the American, sorry, in terms of the American and British experience, the files are a lot easier to find. We have established methods of being able to obtain files digitally, both from the Air Force Historical Records branch in America, but also in the National Archives in Britain. But there are still files in Britain which I can't download. I have to get them to photocopy or digitize manually and then send me the information. And that's not present under the current COVID restrictions. So I have to wait for the time being.
It sounds like an interesting book, and I'm looking forward to reading it when it comes out. Um,
Oh, thank you.
much much success to you in this current book uh, that you just finished. In fact, that's how you and I came to know each other, because I saw you post it
Yeah,
on Twitter, and I obviously have an interest in the Cold War and aviation.
you do.
And it turns out we have a lot of things in common, a lot of common interests, which is great. Again, I
Yes.
appreciate you coming on so late at night. What is it, about 2 o'clock in the morning over there?
What time is it? Yes, it's 2:56 in the morning here.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, almost three. Okay. So, well, with that, Graham, again, I want to thank you for coming on, and I appreciate you being here. I hope you will consider coming back on when your next book comes out, or even before, if you want to talk about something else.
Yeah, I'd love that. Thank you very much.
And I want to thank everybody that
Th-
has tuned in and left comments. We had a few people that leave some comments, and uh, join the conversation a little bit. But I think we'll just call it a night and see y'all next time.